I'd like to say just a few words about quotas. Quotas are one of the ways that societies have formally dealt with discrimination. Discrimination I distinguish from institutionalized discrimination because, for example, everyone can hold prejudices and everyone can be discriminatory in their everyday lives. In fact, we are, and that's why quotas are so important, and I'll get to that. But to the level of being able to determine the destiny of a people, that is a kind of discrimination that reaches the level of institutionalized discrimination, which only majority cultures can do. And I'll talk about two examples from both America and India where an elite, an oppressive elite, and also in South Africa, managed to determine the destinies of an entire people. In India, they were actually, the Brahmins are a minority. The upper caste are a minority, and they managed to do what's done in South Africa and in the United States. So, quotas. Let's look at it today. We often think of quotas in the United States in terms of racial desegregation. And so we had quotas to both integrate African Americans, descendants of former slaves, and also newcomers who were black and who fell on one side of the color line, to integrate them into the workforce and into schools. And so we also have to see busing and desegregation as forms of quotas. And so what these did were counter existing forms of preference that had become institutionalized. And so how housing practices contributed to the tax base that funded local schools, area schools, and the segregation that went on to segregate housing was not something that the government could not combat with quotas, because as we saw from redlining, and we see from white flight and continued white flight, and even the entire creation of suburbs based on white flight, we understand that people will self-segregate. People marry within their own tribes, and so it's pretty safe to say that people will segregate in that way, and that's kind of against integration. The fact that people marry within their tribes, and that's been illegal and discouraged and culturally taboo in many parts of the world, and many parts of the world still is, including in India, marrying across caste. And so we have to really put this into the context of when Martin Luther King was fighting for integration, the battle really did come down to how do we force integration, and that had to come through quotas, and the same thing with women. And now, when we look at integrating women into the workforce, we also see another potent example from the modern day, and that's in the Nordic countries, where the only way that they've been able to use policy to combat sexism, just the way we use policy to combat racism, use policy to combat casteism, it's done through quotas. So in the parliament, they have so many women because they have quotas. But also in the maternity and paternity leave, they said, okay, well, you have to use a portion of that leave for men, to reserve for men, because even culturally, although men and women had the ability to parent and take time away from work, only women were doing it. And you see that in Germany because there are no incentives for men to do it. Lo and behold, men enjoy it. Lo and behold, it's a good thing for society overall that men participate more in care, generally. The most pervasive yet unpaid work that we have, that we know of. And so every time you see someone and you want to say, oh, there's a person of color who's gotten in through quotas, and people have even said that about Barack Obama, it's not that that person is taking the place of a better qualified white male, particularly. Actually, they're taking the place of a less qualified white male, because a college-educated African-American male with no criminal background has less chances at the same job than a high school-educated white man with a criminal background. So if they're competing, in a sense, for the same jobs, when that black person gets that job, they're probably better, much better qualified, or perhaps even overqualified. I know many jobs where they try to hire a lot of black people, and those black people have to be, by definition, have a higher education, more experience than any of the white people they're competing with. They, in a sense, have to be better than. So anytime you see someone who you think has gotten in through a quota, and perhaps they have, it's not just because they got in through the quota and their skin color preference alone. It's that they actually are likely better qualified because they've conquered that hurdle of racial discrimination is so great that just to get their foot in the door, they have to be there when whiteness allows people to just be there. So I'm a firm proponent of quotas because people won't do it themselves. Even in India, when the Prime Minister tried to extend them just a few years ago when I lived there, people descended, professionals, for example, from the All India Institute of Medicine, upper caste, presumably, people who were privileged all along the chain of residence, schooling, education, access. They wore signs on the necks. Who will do this job? Swept, shined shoes on the street and said, who will do these jobs if they increase quotas? People won't do it themselves. We have to do it through policy. It's a social value. It's a public good.